Hi folks, Florida Man here. Today we're going to one of my games on the War in the Americas map, a game that was called Thucydides Trap. It was named, as you can imagine, for a concept coined by the ancient Greek historian and general Thucydides, who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides described the origins of that war as follows, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable." End quote. I think it actually says something about the game of diplomacy. I should mention that the powers in this game are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Great Britain, Mexico, New Granada, Peru, Spain, the United States, and Venezuela. I should also briefly mention that in going over this game, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different from what I normally do to make it easier for people to see what's going on. I'm going to first go over what's happening in the northern part of the map, and then I'll shift to the southern part of the map, with each half taking over the entire screen while I'm explaining its situation. You'll see what I mean shortly. With that out of the way, in this War in the Americas game, I was assigned to play the great nation of the United States of America. And as such, I established diplomatic relations with the neighboring nations before I did anything else. Britain said some favorable things, although I wasn't confident that I had any real friends from the start in this game. Initially, I had plans to work with Mexico and Great Britain against Spain to drive him out of the hemisphere in keeping with good old real-life U.S. history. I had some discussions at length with Mexico about who would get Texas, because he wanted to have that for the first year and then cede it to me later, and I was much more enthusiastic about the idea of it belonging to me right away. I may have been a little stubborn about this. It's hard to recall how one behaved in the sands of history. I did not have nearly as much interaction with the South diplomatically, for obvious reasons, although I did try at least temporarily to establish a decent rapport with the Spanish, in case my plan to drive them into the sea, or rather drive them out of the seas, was unsuccessful. With the opening moves, I felt my efforts had been fairly successful with regard to Great Britain and Mexico, because neither of them opened in a way that was overtly hostile to me. Great Britain has the option early on of going after New York City, which he did not. He instead went for the neutral centers of Toronto and Greenland. Mexico and the South opened to have the option of trying to fight me for Texas. You can see that if we both go for it in the fall, we'll bounce there because that's the way the map is set up, so that Mexico and the USA have equal strength in that area early on. Elsewhere in the north, you can see at least one somewhat worrying sign. Spain opened to Sargasso Sea, which puts two of his units uncomfortably near my coast. You can see it arguably wasn't to his advantage to do so, because he could have bounced Great Britain's attempt to move into East Caribbean, and if he had done so, it would keep Britain from likely going after the neutral islands that are more naturally Spanish, as well as potentially walking into the Spanish home center of Puerto Rico. The British islands in the Caribbean had a really good opening, just like the British units in Canada, well positioned to go for neutral centers. What I personally was concerned about in spring 1841 was not having a second build. I had to be sure I convinced the Mexican player to let me into Texas in the fall. Otherwise, I would look like a pretty weak USA player, which would likely turn my neighbors against me as a group. In the south, we see New Granada, the Orange power, pushing out into the Caribbean with his fleet and opening to capture the neutral center of Ecuador with his Bogota army. We see that Peru has not opened so as to challenge New Granada for Ecuador, which is one of Peru's potential openings. To the east, we see that Venezuela opened in a way that one could say was trusting of New Granada, moving east and south. If New Granada had been hostile, he could have opened to Orinoquia and had a free shot at taking either of two Venezuelan home centers, so leaving both of those home centers as well as Orinoquia vacant shows that Venezuela is being really trusting toward New Granada in the first season. New Granada appears to have good relations with his land-based neighbors so far, which may perhaps explain why he felt it was a good idea to open into a sea space, rather than just putting his fleet directly in Panama. He is testing the waters there, so to speak. If we look at the Peruvian opening, we can see he's going for La Paz and Santa Cruz, which are in the center of the map. Geographically, this feels like a challenge to Brazil, who is the largest power in the map, not counting Great Britain, and the only one who could contest the centers Peru is going for right now. The Peruvian opening and Venezuelan opening show a common purpose of targeting Brazil first. There was discussion in the public press, by the way, about whether Brazil would fail to enter orders. Ultimately, as you can see, he does enter orders, and in fact, in the entire game, no one ever surrendered. And with the settings of this game, failing to enter orders twice would automatically surrender you. but the fact that they were having this discussion indicates that we weren't sure if Brazil was actively playing, which means he wasn't really talking to anybody. So you can imagine there's a coalition forming against him, and Peru and Venezuela are almost certainly part of it. Brazil himself opened in what I would call a sort of non-committal way, trying his luck in a few directions at once. He had a unit in mid-Atlantic Ocean in the northern half of the map, and he had a fleet in Bahia de Paranagua open toward Argentina, and his other units seemed to open toward neutrals near Peru and Venezuela respectively. It's as if this opening, like the lack of press, is designed to turn everyone against him and put his game on hard mode. Going even further south, Argentina opened in a way that was relatively anti-Brazilian too, while being neutral or friendly toward the lone British unit in the Falklands. Argentina was poised to capture the two neutral centers between himself and Brazil could only potentially bounce one of them, with no chance of capturing either if Argentina continued on course. On the western side, Chile opened to capture the neutral centers of Easter Island and Antofagasta, as well as to take a shot at either the British neutral target of Patagonia or the freshly vacated Argentine center of Cordoba. So we can see some rough alignments here. It seems as if Chile might not be friendly to Argentina, while everyone else appears unfriendly to Brazil, and New Granada is friendly with everyone so far. We will see what happens in fall. Following my 1841 fall negotiations, you can see I am fortunate enough to have successfully gotten Mexico to not mess with Texas. Leave that to me, so I do get my second build, while Mexico only gets one for now, positioning to take California early next year. Things appear to be going my way with Britain as well. He moves against Spain as I had hoped, taking Puerto Rico from Spain as I had thought might be plausible previously. At the same time, Spain attacked Great Britain by taking Jamaica, which hopefully meant they would have reason to continue going after each other. Brazil tried to pull his unit from mid-Atlantic Ocean south, which would have also helped by removing an unnecessary third party from the northern half of the map, but this bounced with Britain attempting to move to the same space, the South Atlantic Ocean. Speaking of the South, we see that as a result of Britain moving to the South Atlantic Ocean instead of trying to take Patagonia as he had seemed positioned to do last season, Chile takes that center successfully, in addition to the other two centers he was positioned to get, Easter Island and Antofagasta. Argentina tried to go for two builds, and he got one, bouncing with Brazil in Asunción. Speaking of Brazil, he continues to have no apparent friends. All but one of Brazil's moves bounce, and although he gets into Suriname, we can see that with Venezuela having captured Manaus and Georgetown, he can take Suriname from Brazil if he wants to do that sometime early next year. New Granada, in his corner, expands peacefully in all directions. He has still avoided making any enemies, which gives him remarkable flexibility. Peru, on the west coast, moves into the South Pacific Ocean, staking out a claim on both Galapagos and Hawaii. Peru also gets Santa Cruz. On the whole, I think Peru looked the most ambitious out of all these powers to the south, with Chile being a close second and New Granada third. So Brazil's position is very bad, while Argentina was somewhat hampered by Brazil's choices, and Chile, Peru, New Granada, and Venezuela look like powerful competitors here. In particular, Chile, Peru, and New Granada look like the powers to watch. In winter 1841, we see that I built fleets in Washington, D.C. and Charleston, while Britain built one in Halifax. Mexico was supposed to join us and build on his east coast and join in on the Spanish invasion with me and Britain. And instead, he built on the west coast and said he was basically just going to secure the western supply centers. I didn't argue with him, I just decided to invade him, because out of all the potential allies I'd been considering, this made me feel he was the least trustworthy person. The least reliable. Spain built two new fleets too, with no other choice really. In the south, we see New Granada build two fleets, one on each of its coasts, suggesting an intention to become involved in the Caribbean War, as well as to stake a claim for either Galapagos or some part of Peru, probably, which sets them up to be rivals. Chile built two fleets and an army, which also doesn't particularly look good for the Peruvians. Peru built a fleet and an army which seemed necessary but potentially inadequate to me. Argentina's only new unit was an army the same as Brazil. It was hard to guess where they might each be going, except that the two neighbors would probably continue to fight each other. Venezuela built a fleet and an army in locations that were again away from the border with New Granada, suggesting an intention to continue trusting him. This confirms what I said before about New Granada being one of the powers to watch. But not so much Venezuela. If you're in this position of trusting your neighbor not to attack you, it's usually not a particular positive. Going to spring 1842, we see that I launched this invasion I mentioned into Mexico, and it's rather unilateral because my ally right now is Great Britain, who isn't exactly positioned to help me here. I figured that I could win a unilateral attack on Mexico because I would have the element of surprise, and no one was likely to come to his aid. We see Mexico actually leaves his homeland essentially completely undefended this season as well, so I can take either Mexico City or Veracruz if I want to. The only problem I have is Mexico appears to be poised to gain 3 neutral centers this season. Maybe I didn't think this through all the way. To the east, we see Britain and I are engaging against the Spanish together. So even if Mexico may gain builds despite losing a home center, I will hopefully get my own builds from both him and Spain to counteract his growth. In the Caribbean, Spain was doing a good job of defending himself, though. That was a little worrying. We will see if we manage to outthink the Spanish when our troops collide with his in the fall. To the south, things are going somewhat as I predicted. Brazil and Argentina are continuing to clash over Asuncion. Peru is continuing to attack Brazil. Interestingly, Chile moved against Argentina this season and also against Peru, so we are seeing battle lines drawn. Peru is going for Hawaii, while Chile seems poised to take Galapagos out from under his nose. For right now, interestingly, we see New Granada appears to not really be doing anything about this. Instead, he's moving up into the Caribbean to interfere with the fight between Spain and Britain, which is a big threat to me and my ally, considering he's creeping up on Nicaragua. But it's also interesting because it avoids him having to confront any of his land-based neighbors. Venezuela appears to be moving to join this fight too, although his attempt to enter the East Caribbean bounced with Britain. In the east, Venezuela is joining in the attack on Brazil as well. Going to fall 1842, after having attacked Mexico without any warning, I start engaging in vigorous diplomacy with various other powers within reach to establish an anti-Spanish coalition that is not reliant on Mexico, and to get South American nations with navies to attack Mexico. I'm very nervous about this situation with New Granada and Venezuela apparently trying to enter the Caribbean, clearly with some sort of a common purpose in mind, and I need to do whatever I can to counter it. I'm devoting all my armies to the war with Mexico. I'm regretting this invasion already because he got the 3 neutral centers I was expecting him to obtain, and in the Caribbean, Britain and I still aren't actually drawing any blood versus Spain. It's really bad that things are going so slowly, especially because New Granada has just seized Nicaragua from the British. I'm also a little concerned about the fact that Britain's fleets are sort of at the back end of our battle lines, so they're positioned where they could move fairly quickly against me if Britain decided on a stab. There's a lot for me to be nervous about here. Also, this is not super important, but Brazil holds the Mid-Atlantic Ocean in place this season. The Caribbean doesn't look very good right now. In the south, New Granada finally put one of his fleets into the contested waters around him and Peru. As expected, Peru takes Hawaii, while Chile slips into the Galapagos. Mexico also pulled a unit down to become involved, despite my fight with him. The stage looked set for a large-scale naval confrontation involving each of the west coast powers of the Americas. Further east, Chile captured Cordoba from Argentina, even as Argentina again got bounced in his effort to take Asuncion, making this the 3rd season in a row. Peru began invading Brazil with a move into Mato Grosso. I think this is a possible strategic mistake because he's already locked into what looks like a naval entanglement with his southern neighbor, which I expected to escalate to war soon, and by taking some of Brazil he's also creating an opportunity for other powers who might want those centers to join in attacking him. Imagine that Peru succeeds here in taking over much of what currently constitutes Brazil. New Granada and Venezuela wouldn't be able to attack anyone to the south of them without going through Peru first, and the same applies to Chile and Argentina attacking north. Speaking of Brazil, he's losing ground slowly but surely. Venezuela finally positioned this season to be able to take Suriname sometime next year, so very shortly, I expect Brazil will be left with nothing but home centers. Looking to the build phase, we see Mexico gets 2 new armies, right next to the Mexican center I just captured, which is just dandy, of course. Spain acquires another new fleet, which is about equally beneficial to my position. To the south, New Granada builds an army, and Venezuela doesn't get any new units, so at least there will be no new threats coming from that direction. Brazil doesn't get any new units either, so there is nothing to rescue him from the horrible direction his game has been going in thus far, unless he's made a new deal with one of his neighbors. Peru gets a new army too, which is positioned more for fighting Chile than anyone else, while Chile gets a fleet and an army that could be for either Peru or Argentina. Meanwhile, Argentina had to destroy his army on the frontier with Brazil to focus on his border with Chile, and Britain destroyed his southern fleet to focus more on the fighting in the north, which I approved of. Spring 1843, is my season of crisis. At this point, things that were held in a delicate balance, and could have still worked out for me, began to turn sideways. I attempted to attack Mexico by moving into Apacheria, Chihuahua, and Gulf of Mexico, trying to make the best of my situation by throwing everything I could into the attack. However, Mexico and Spain bounced all of those moves. On the Caribbean side, it felt like things were going slightly better, because I took the Bahamas from Spain. Unfortunately, overshadowing events in the West and the Caribbean, the British moved from Toronto down into Michigan, and from Bermuda Triangle into Gulf Stream. He was bringing down the sword that had been hanging over my head. The stab was on. In the Caribbean, various things were happening. Spain supported New Granada's fleets moving up north into Spain's own territory. New Granada also moved an army up toward Mexico's southernmost center of Guatemala. Great Britain pulled his East Caribbean fleet back up to Puerto Rico, and Brazil moved out of mid-Atlantic Ocean into Anegada Passage, where he had a shot at being involved in the Caribbean struggle. But the time of being concerned with what was going on in the Caribbean looked to be over for me now. My whole focus would go to the coup that was ongoing in the north, and trying to survive by talking at least one of my neighbors into giving up the fight with me. I should note that talking my way out of near-death situations has always been one of my diplomacy strengths, and so I was not giving up just yet. I intended to fight to the bitter end. Going south, this is the season when Venezuela's unit in Cumana attacks and takes Trinidad from Britain. This will be one of the many points I cite in my arguments to Great Britain, that by attacking me he's going after his only ally on this board. The Spanish are probably quite delighted to have him going after me instead of them, but considering the behavior of their close allies in New Granada and Venezuela, it's pretty unlikely that they'll be appeased by Britain offering me up as a sacrifice to try and escape from their vengeance. His best shot is to work with me, fight together, negotiate together, and convince the enemy that they will either lose an extended fight, or that we'll drag it out so long that it won't be worth it. Another option is winning Mexico over to our side, as we had before I decided to attack Mexico. Looking to the conflict between Venezuela and Brazil, we see Venezuela has made a serious mistake in the south, perhaps his first serious mistake of the game, by failing to defend the interior of Venezuela from a land attack that was easy to see coming, resulting in Brazil walking into the Venezuelan home center of Angostura. Happening at the same time and at the worst possible moment, New Granada moves his armies to border the Venezuelan home center of Maracaibo. If Venezuela gets stabbed here, this could basically take him out of the game, so he needs to negotiate vigorously himself if he wants to survive. Further south, in addition to the successful attack on Venezuela, Brazil is throwing the other half of his forces into the wars with both Peru and Argentina. This comes at the same time that Chile is attacking Argentina, which is lucky for Brazil, but he still doesn't really have the forces for this fight. Peru takes the neutral center of Asunción that Argentina and Brazil had repeatedly bounced over, which suggests to me he's also going to take over the heavy lifting of killing off Brazil. I had disliked Peru's position a bit, because he was going to put himself in the middle between Chile and Argentina and the northern powers by taking out Brazil, but it's looking more and more like Peru might grow too large to be easily defeated, so maybe this strategy will pay off. In fall 1843, we see that my efforts to persuade Britain away from the stab are less than successful. He walks into Washington, D.C., successfully and presumably burns my capital city, while I bounce him in Chicago and begin pulling everything back into a defensive position. The messages I'm sending Britain now are telling him how short-sighted this is, how Spain and Mexico will not leave him alone just because he foolishly turned on his only ally, and that it's not too late to try and salvage this situation. However, the reality is that he probably won't stop, so I'm pulling everything I have back toward the homeland for defense. I abandon the Mexican center of Veracruz, and I abandon the naval frontier with Spain, allowing him to advance to Gulf of Mexico and Sargasso Sea, which positions him to retake Bahamas and begin attacking my east coast, as well as ultimately Britain, I expect. Mexico, meanwhile, positions to retake Veracruz, walks into Alaska, and moves his California unit toward my centers. So Mexico isn't going to be willing to make peace with me either. I certainly understand that. Now that Britain is attacking me, I'm looking very weak and ready to be taken out with only a minimal commitment on his part. Why would he let me live, when at the moment I'm asking for a truce, I seem ready to collapse like a house of cards? Going to the south, we see Peru suddenly move into the seas closer to New Granada, as well as moving an army up toward New Granada, at the same time that New Granada has attacked Venezuela by taking Maracaibo. We also see Peru supporting Chile against Argentina in the south. It looks like the alliance structure in the south has changed, with Chile and Peru aligned against everyone else. They're set to catch both Argentina and New Granada with their pants down. Argentina was already seemingly on the way out, while New Granada was in the middle of breaking his relationship with his only other partner, Venezuela. Peru was extremely well plugged in to see this coming, and all I can say is that I wish I could have engineered this myself before New Granada and Venezuela had interfered in the Caribbean War and helped turn Britain against me. All this goes to show the importance of paying attention to other regions of the map in a diplomacy game. Even if it's not immediately obvious how developments there can help or hurt you, you may be surprised by how much of an impact seemingly faraway powers can have. Naturally, I was actually trying to influence what happened down there. I had been trying to get Peru to deal with New Granada for years, but I didn't have much to offer in terms of leverage, so when it finally happened, it was too late to do me any good. This development in the south might theoretically have helped Brazil, since two of his main opponents were being attacked, but unfortunately for him, this was also the season when Peru walked into Belo Horizonte, one of the Brazilian home centers. This showed that even though Brazil's other two enemies were being attacked, no one was actually allied with the Brazilians. I believe that makes the entire game with no one working with Brazil, and if I remember right, he wasn't communicating with anyone either, so that makes perfect sense. The only positive for Brazil was that he snuck into the Argentine center of Uruguay, further reducing Argentina's strength. Great Britain still had his one fleet in the south, defending the Falklands against the corrupt Argentinian government's unwarranted attacks successfully, by the way. In the build phase, the good thing is that because I still have the Bahamas and Veracruz, I don't have to destroy anything. Also, Britain didn't have any builds, because even though he was cannibalizing me, his only ally, he was still being eaten by everyone else. Another bright side, Mexico's build was a West Coast fleet, suggesting he wasn't particularly worried about the North American War. He had been kind enough to leave me in control of Veracruz temporarily too, which was an encouraging sign that he wasn't especially determined to see me disappear. The Spanish, I felt certain, were another story. Spain didn't have any builds this season, but he already had everything he needed, with Britain short-sightedly helping him, to kill me off. Looking to the south, New Granada gets a West Coast fleet, presumably planning to defend himself against what looks like an overwhelming Peruvian attack. Peru got a new fleet and a new army as close to the front with New Granada as possible. Argentina destroyed his only fleet, choosing to focus on defending his actual remaining pair of centers, rather than poking Britain for no good reason. Brazil got an army build, and he chose to put it in Rio de Janeiro. I suspect this was a strategic mistake, like most of Brazil's decisions, but it didn't really matter what Brazil built. His centers would be too far apart to defend at this point anyway, since Uruguay was far away from Angostura and Rio de Janeiro. Brazil's survival going forward would be just a matter of how long he continued to be lucky. In spring 1844, you can see there are a number of bounces in North America. Britain is still fruitlessly attempting to attack me, and Mexico and I have some miscommunications that lead to a couple of our units bouncing. I defend the Bahamas, although Spain does not attack it. Spain continued to work against me and with New Granada, although New Granada convoys out of Honduras and begins pulling back to defend his besieged homeland now. Bizarrely, Britain chose this moment to sneak into Mexican-controlled Guatemala. In the south, New Granada, in addition to defending himself with reasonable effectiveness from Peru, continues to attack Venezuela, which is where the convoy out of Honduras went. Peru is increasingly surrounding New Granada, carefully positioning to absorb him suddenly and completely. Chile is taking over where Argentina left off, moving to take the Falklands from Britain, who is pretty weak in that region. He's also moving to finish off Argentina, putting 3 units right next to Argentina's last 2 centers. Brazil makes decisions. I don't know if they're even worth talking about, he's just randomly attacking things. Going to the fall, Mexico is now seemingly on my side, against the sporadically treacherous British. He moves into Rupert's Land, a bridge toward attacking Canada, and he retakes Guatemala, the center Britain had snuck into in spring. Mexico also kindly continues to allow me to borrow Veracruz. In the east, though, I'm losing ground, losing Bahamas to Spain and New York City to Britain. I'm not giving up, but this season is where I have to admit, my goose is clearly cooked. In the Caribbean, every power who isn't Britain or Spain is withdrawing, which leaves Spain the uncontested master of that region. With the current status quo, there's nothing to stop Spain and Britain from steamrolling me, and the only thing keeping me alive is that Mexico finds me more likable than Britain. However, with pressure from the Spanish, my personal charm is unlikely to overwhelm the simple imperialist imperative to wipe out both of the English-speaking nations so that Spain and Mexico can rule over the whole of the continent and all its little islands. To the south, Peru penetrates deep into New Granada's territory. New Granada acquires exactly the same number of centers from Venezuela, and Venezuela cries out, "Why me? What a world! What a world!" Brazil continues to do pointless things, while Chile absorbs the remaining Argentine territory and almost takes the Falklands. In the build phase, I destroy my fleet in Florida, choosing to focus in the end on the British threat rather than the Spanish one. I would rather be invaded from without than betrayed by a power from within my own alliance, so I'm hoping now I can drag Britain down with me and prove that he was unwise to betray me. Britain builds an army and a fleet in Canada. Spain gets a new fleet in Havana, which at this point I don't care about. I know my time is short. In the south, New Granada doesn't have destroys or builds, thanks to simultaneously invading and being invaded. Venezuela shrinks to 2 units that will undoubtedly be absorbed in fighting Brazil, while New Granada tries to finish them both off. Peru builds 2 new armies, while Chile builds an army and a fleet. In spring 1845, Mexico moves into Ontario, still attacking British-controlled Canada. Britain continues trying to pick my pocket with Spanish help, but he is unsuccessful this season. Spain positions for an attack on New Orleans in the fall. Britain also moves his Falkland Islands fleet up into the mid-Atlantic Ocean, dishonorably giving up on defending the Falklands. In South America, Venezuela and Brazil trade centers, while Brazil and Peru continue to wrestle in the Brazilian homeland. Chile occupies the Falklands, and his massive armies moves northeast toward Brazil. Above, Peru and New Granada scuffle, including New Granada retaking Panama. Peru looks well positioned to take Cali from New Granada and make New Granada pay for the loss of Panama, though. In fall, we see Spain succeeds in taking New Orleans from me. I continue to keep Great Britain from taking anything, though, and he's forced to waste a unit, preventing Mexico from advancing further into Canada. However, Mexico did help Spain take New Orleans, which I was trying to persuade him not to do. So my fate is sealed, if that was in doubt. Interestingly, New Granada is trying to grab at a Spanish center this season, anything to keep from receding into irrelevance in South America, but Britain bounces him. I think that was at a Spanish request. Spain and Mexico also mounts in Nicaragua, which I'm imagining was not coordinated because I can't think of a reason why it would be. In the southern half, Mexico moves into Hawaii and pulls another fleet down toward the naval action going on in this region. Peru takes Galapagos from Chile with Chile's support, protecting that center from Mexico apparently. However, Peru fails to retake Panama from New Granada, giving New Granada a little bit of extra life. In almost equally damaging news, Venezuela has slipped a unit behind Peru's lines right next to 3 Peruvian centers. It seems implausible that this won't result in Venezuela taking something from Peru next year. Looking to Brazil, he loses Georgetown to Venezuela, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo to Peru, and Sao Salvador to Britain of all countries, leaving Brazil with only a few centers scattered in random corners of South America, including only one of his home centers. It's an even bet whether Brazil or Venezuela dies first at this point, I think. I just hope they don't outlast me. How embarrassing Brazil outlasting me would be. Meanwhile, Chile has surrounded the isolated and vulnerable Brazilian center of Uruguay. Looking to the builds, I destroy the unit in Florida for being pretty much useless at this point, and the unit in Texas for being in a nearly indefensible position. Spain gets a new fleet in Havana, Mexico builds a fleet in Guadalajara, and an army in Mexico City, indicating he's still not very committed to fighting in North America. He's more interested in the South, and he's certainly not planning on fighting Spain, which was honestly my last possible chance of saving myself, I think. On the bright side, the British don't get a build. To the south, Brazil destroys that Uruguay unit I mentioned that was surrounded before, Chile builds a fleet, and New Granada puts a new army in Bogotá, hunkering down so he can hopefully defend his corner of the continent for a while longer. Just looking at the map rather than going from memory, I am worried for him that Brazil, who is now his neighbor, will help Peru overcome New Granada, because Brazil has played very poorly in general so far, so it wouldn't seem strange to me at all if he helped his long-standing enemy to defeat another power. In spring 1846, I accept my fate. Rather than trying to work and bounce back, I'm now trying to drag the British player who betrayed me down with me. Mexico pledges to help me with this, while Spain moves opportunistically, and Britain tries to defend himself. In the south, to my great surprise, Brazil appears to be having a bit of a renaissance. He retakes Sao Salvador, which Britain just vacated, along with taking the last two Venezuelan centers. New Granada continues to hold out fairly well despite being besieged by Peru. It's starting to look like Peru's eyes were bigger than his belly here. Venezuela sneaks into La Paz, one of Peru's first centers. Unfortunately for Peru, his longtime ally, Chile, suddenly moves all of his units toward Peruvian centers. It looks like this might be the moment when Chile, who has steadily conquered the entire southern cone, tries to take over the rest of the continent and win the solo. In fall, I lose another center, this time Charleston, to Spain. On the bright side, Mexico continues to act in sympathy with me, leaving Texas in my hands, and Britain gains no ground at all, except that Spain apparently gave him the Bahamas. In the south, the invasion of Peru is on. Chile takes 4 centers off of him instantly, and Peru is still fighting with New Granada. Venezuela walks into the Peruvian home center of Arequipa. It looks very bad down there. Surprisingly, Brazil's gunboat diplomacy continues to hold steady. It looks like he'll outlive me after all. In the build phase, I destroy my Virginia unit. To the south, Venezuela destroys the unit that's near his homeland, while Peru destroys units that are farther from the front with Chile, as well as his Amazonia unit for some reason, and Chile builds 2 fleets and an army. In the spring of 1847, not much happens in the north. Britain and Spain continue to try to attack my last centers, and Mexico continues to keep me on life support. In the south, Peru is clearly slowly dying. Chile is growing out of control. In fall, Mexico finally takes Texas from me, reducing me to 1 center. At this point, I don't really mind. I'm just determined that Britain not survive either, and I'm saying that to whoever will listen, which here just means Mexico. For now, though, he still has Spain as a sponsor, and Spain seems to be using the British Navy as part of his effort to control the seas between himself and South America. In the south, things are looking grave for everyone who isn't Chile, but a wonderful thing is happening. Everyone who isn't Chile is working together against him. New Granada passes up an opportunity to retake Ecuador from Peru. Mexico supports New Granada into Galapagos, and even Brazil joins in the group attack on Chile. In the builds, I destroy my last unit besides Chicago, the unit in my last remaining center. Mexico builds another West Coast fleet. In the south, New Granada builds a West Coast fleet. Peru is forced to destroy 2, including 1 close to the front line, and Chile builds 1 fleet and 2 armies, perhaps sensing that this conflict will be settled on land and not at sea. Spring 1848 is mainly notable for the fact that Spain finally turns on Great Britain, capturing the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. Mexico also takes New Orleans from Spain, but I believe that was agreed to so that Mexico could grow as well. In the south, Chile continues to slowly but relentlessly advance by land, and hold his ground fairly well at sea. In the fall, Spain and Mexico finally decide that I've overstayed my welcome and kill me off. It's really a small mercy at this point. I don't really care very much for being on life support for so long, given that I had no prospect of recovery. I'm happy to see they're also slowly closing in around the British. This season has the other noteworthy feature of seeing Chile advance into the mid-Atlantic Ocean, which suggests he really could solo, depending on how well or how poorly the surviving players unite. We will see what happens in that regard. In the south, Chile seems to be doing well at holding his own against the other smaller powers. They only get centers from each other this season, not Chile, and even if that was arranged, it's not a great result for their efforts. Looking to the eastern side of the continent, Chile supports Britain into Sao Salvador this season. As a result, Peru won't have a build. On the bright side, their teamwork remains very united, with even Brazil clearly on the same page. In the build phase, Spain gets 2 new fleets, which I would say demonstrate his intent to go after the British rather than helping stop Chile directly. In the south, New Granada gets a new army while Great Britain destroys the unit that had taken Sao Salvador, clearly focusing on the northern defense that is so critical to his survival. Elsewhere, the south is almost in a brief stasis. I will note that for the remainder of this game, the north is very boring, so I will go over it in brief. In the next few years, Spain and Mexico killed off Great Britain and devoted their units to pushing Chile out of their hemisphere, and the spirit of the United States was able to finally rest in peace now that the power that had treacherously attacked me had finally been put down like the mangy dog he was. Looking to the south, in spring 1849 we see Brazil successfully take Sao Salvador back, and the Chilean military fails to advance on its other fronts. In the fall, New Granada attacks Peru because although he's on the border with Chile, he's not indispensable in their defense. New Granada also moves against Brazil, taking Angostura from him, even as Brazil continues assisting in the fight against Chile. In addition to successfully flipping New Granada, Chile also moves into Sao Salvador and successfully destroys the Brazilian unit there. In the build phase, New Granada continues the show of having flipped sides by building a fleet facing the Caribbean rather than the critical west coastline, where it might have joined the fight against Chile much more easily than this northern fleet. New Granada also gets an army. Chile gets a new fleet, while Peru is reduced to 2 armies that are fully surrounded by New Granada and Chile's units. In spring 1850, New Granada continued to fight alongside Chile, attacking into the Brazilian center of Manaus. Brazil returned fire by occupying New Granada's center of Trinidad, and in an apparent stab of his ally, Chile took Peru's support into New Granada's center of Lima, as well as invading the Amazonia region. I have not been mentioning this, by the way, but the naval warfare involving Chile versus the other powers continued to be completely static and uneventful, with virtually no forward progress for either side. Going to fall 1850, the solo-seeking jig was clearly up for Chile, who had burned his credibility with New Granada and who had no other prospective allies. Chile proposed a draw between the powers of Mexico, New Granada, Chile, Peru, and Spain. Over the next season or so, this gained the approval of all the included powers, but that wasn't enough to end the game. Although Brazil and the out-of-sight Britain were no longer substantial powers, they remained substantial enough to veto the draw vote. We see that in terms of moves, Chile gained his center this season, and he's still holding his own, but he also lost Lima immediately. In the 1850 builds, Chile gets 2 more fleets and New Granada rebuilds an army. In spring 1851, almost nothing of consequence happens, except that New Granada positions to attack Brazil in fall. But in the fall, a few interesting things occur. New Granada occupies Brazilian-controlled Georgetown, Peru takes Lima from New Granada, and Chile makes a marginal advance by sea. In the build, New Granada again builds an army in Bogotá. Going to spring 1852, Peru supports Chile in continuing to attack New Granada, although Chile doesn't actually get into a center as a result. Although Chile's fleets advance on both eastern and western coasts, the only center that changes hands is Manaus, which flips to New Granada. In fall, the action intensifies. Peru moves his armies north to join Chile in attacking New Granada, Mexico shifts more fleets down to help in the Western Naval War with Chile, and although New Granada keeps Manaus, Brazil supports Chile into Granadan-controlled Georgetown. Just looking at this season, it seems as if everyone had a bone to pick with New Granada by this point in the game. After the fall, both New Granada and Chile had builds, but they didn't change the balance of power. In spring 1853, things still seemed to be going Chile's way. He advanced by sea in the west, and Peru continued to work with and support him. It looked like slow going, particularly because New Granada destroyed one of Peru's 3 armies this season, but it seemed as if Chile might still grind down his opposition and win. On an unrelated note, it was at this point that Spain was free to become involved in the warfare going on in the south, and he took Trinidad from Brazil this season. With the fall, Peru and Chile advanced further against New Granada, moving up the west coast and again retaking Manaus, for what seems to be at least the 5th or 6th time that center has changed hands. Unfortunately for Chile, this is where it all fell apart. With the build phase, things seemed basically normal. New Granada built a new army in Bogotá, his favorite army construction location, and Chile got another fleet, since the 11 he already had weren't good enough. However, Peru also got a build, and he put his new army closer to Chile than to the front with New Granada. In the spring of 1854, Peru turns on Chile, walking into La Paz unopposed. Above them, New Granada finally takes the last Brazilian center. The result of all this is seen in the fall moves, which see Chile just defending and not really trying hard to advance either. I think he's seen the writing on the wall, and basically given up at this point, and the decision-making here reflects that. So finally, after those fall 1854 orders, the game ends with a draw between the surviving powers, Mexico, New Granada, Chile, Peru, and Spain. If you're wondering, these are the same powers from the earlier proposed draw from 4 years before. However, I think the extra years did add something. Specifically, the impression I had from the public press was that those who held up against the Chilean onslaught were very pleased with themselves for keeping their alliance together and stopping Chile. I tended to agree there was some very impressive play here that was reflected in which powers remained alive for the draw. It was the ambitious but cautious Mexico, the continually expanding and backstabbing New Granada, the solo-adjacent Chile, the comeback kid Peru, and the ruthless Spain. I thought they all played impressive games, with Peru's performance particularly impressive as he danced a knife's edge on the verge of dying for the latter half of the game, and New Granada's performance particularly noteworthy because he showed all the viciousness that I expect of a diplomacy champion. Spain had an interesting thought that he shared in the public press. He suggested that in the War in the Americas map, playing as Spain is similar to playing as Austria in the classic map, with strong neighbors, an exposed position, and limited opportunities for uncontested expansion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you liked this Florida Man Diplomacy production. If so, please like, subscribe, and check out more of my content. If you've previously seen my War in the Americas videos, I hope you enjoyed the close-up version I showed you of the map this time. I would also like to thank the individuals named in the credits here, because they help fuel this channel's growth, through contributions on Patreon or by translating the videos into other languages. You too can be one of my all-star supporters by joining them. Until next time, Florida Man, out.